This is my true story. My son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, turned against me. One evening, in a moment of rage, he kicked me 9 times into the dirt while his wife stood and watched. That day broke my body, but it did not break my spirit. I rose from that ground with a plan that would change his life forever. I did not fight with fists. I fought with silence, patience, and a pen. Before I tell you how I gave his wife everything, subscribe so these stories reach more people worldwide. I was not born rich. My hands were my only tools, my back was my only strength, and my hope was my only wealth. From the first day my son was born, I promised myself that he would not feel the same hunger I felt as a child. I worked long hours in the fields, under the burning sun, with sweat dripping into my eyes, carrying stones, cutting wood, and bending my bones until they cried. The home I built was not just bricks and walls. It was the story of my blood, the story of my broken skin, and the story of years I could never take back. Every meal I skipped was a step toward his comfort. I endured hunger so that his stomach could be full. I walked to work barefoot so that he could wear shoes to school. I wore the same torn coat through the winters so that he could sleep under a warm blanket. The sacrifices were endless, but I never counted them. Each time I returned home with aching bones and empty pockets, I smiled when I saw his laughter. It was enough. His smile was the roof I lived under. His life was the air I breathed. My son was not just my child. He was my reason. The nights were the hardest. I would come home with tired muscles and aching joints, yet I would sit awake sewing his clothes or mending his shoes by the dim light of an old lamp. Sometimes I would hear his soft breathing as he slept, and I would remember my father, who never had the chance to give me the same. I told myself again and again, this boy will not live the life I lived. He will have more, he will stand taller, and he will thank me one day for building this path for him. I believed it with all my heart. I trusted in that dream more than I trusted in my own body. Years passed, and with every passing year, my sacrifices grew. When food was scarce, I gave him the bigger portion. When money was short, I paid for his school books instead of medicine for my pain. When storms came, I stood outside repairing the roof so that his sleep would not be disturbed. I faced insults from men who said I was weak, but I let those words pass because I was building something stronger than pride. I was building a home, not just for me, but for him. For his future, for the family I thought he would one day protect with pride. The home itself was more than wood and stone. Every wall held the sound of my hammer, every nail carried the weight of my sweat. I carried bricks on my shoulders when my back already bent from age. I mixed cement with cracked hands that bled into the dust. I saved coin after coin until I could buy enough to place a roof above us. That roof became my shield against the world. It was where my son grew, where his footsteps echoed in the mornings, where his laughter filled the nights. I thought that house would stand forever as a symbol of my love and sacrifice. But sacrifice is a strange thing. It does not come with guarantees. It comes with hope, with faith, with blind trust that the love you pour into someone will one day return. I lived with that faith every day, never questioning it, never doubting it. When my body was broken, I said it was worth it. When my dreams faded, I said his dreams mattered more. I thought the bond between father and son could never be broken. Not by time, not by pain, not by the cruelty of the world. I believed family was stronger than everything. I worked not only for him, but also for the bloodline that would come after him. I thought he would carry my name with pride. I thought he would protect what I built as if it were sacred. I thought he would pass the house down to his children with stories of his father who gave everything. I thought he would never forget the sacrifices made for him, the years given away for his comfort. I thought wrong. My heart never allowed me to imagine betrayal, because betrayal was a stranger to me. But sometimes, the people you love most are the ones who teach you the meaning of it. Still, in those early years, I had no reason to doubt. I lived in hope. I lived in sacrifice. I lived in the belief that I had done my part well. I was not educated, but I gave him an education. I was not wealthy, But I gave him the taste of wealth in small comforts. I was not strong forever, but I gave him the strength of a home that stood tall. That was my life. A life built on sacrifice, silent and unseen, yet powerful and real. I gave him everything, and I asked for nothing in return except love, respect, and the bond I thought could never be broken. The evening carried a heavy silence, the kind that presses against the walls of a home and makes the air thick. My son's anger had been building like a storm, silent at first, then louder with each passing day. That night, the storm broke. His voice rose higher than ever before, sharp like thunder, cutting through me with words I had long feared to hear. But words were not enough for him anymore. His rage spilled over into action, into something I never imagined I would face from the child I once carried in my arms. I remember the moment with painful clarity. His eyes were wild, burning with a fire I could not recognize. His fists clenched, his body shaking with fury, as though I was not his father, but an enemy standing in his way. Then came the first kick, sudden and brutal, striking my ribs with a force that sent me stumbling backward. Before I could breathe, before I could even gather myself, another blow came, harder than the first. My body folded under the pain, but his anger was not satisfied. He kept going, each kick landing like a hammer, 9 times in total, each one breaking more than just bone, breaking trust, breaking blood, breaking the very bond of family. I fell into the dirt, my body weak and trembling. The ground beneath me felt cold and unforgiving, yet it was warmer than the heart of my own son in that moment. Dust filled my mouth as I gasped for air, and the taste of betrayal mixed with the taste of earth. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, some cruel vision that would pass with the morning light. But the pain in my chest and the bruises forming across my body told me it was real, painfully real. My own son had struck me down, not with one careless blow, but with 9 deliberate strikes that spoke of cruelty, not accident. And as I lay there, I turned my head and saw her, his wife, standing a few steps away. Her face was pale, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl, her eyes wide but silent. She watched everything unfold, watched me fall, watched him kick again and again, watched the dust rise around me with each blow. She did not laugh, she did not cheer. She stood frozen, caught between fear and sorrow. I could see the tears in her eyes that she tried so hard to hide. In that moment, I understood she was as trapped as I was, bound to his anger, forced to watch but unable to speak. The night stretched on, though it was only a few minutes of violence. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching the cruelty into an eternity I could not escape. I remembered when my son was a child, when his legs were small and weak, and I carried him on my shoulders through mud and rain so he would not fall. Now those same legs struck me down, again and again, driving me into the earth like I was nothing more than dust beneath his feet. The contrast cut deeper than any wound. The father who once carried his son was now being kicked into the dirt by the very child he raised. The stars above looked down, silent witnesses to my humiliation. I thought of the neighbors, perhaps hearing the noise, perhaps closing their doors and turning away. Shame wrapped itself around me, heavier than the night air. This was not only pain. This was not only betrayal. This was the destruction of dignity, the erasing of every sacrifice I had made. A man can endure hunger. A man can endure hard labor. A man can endure loneliness. But to endure this, to endure his own son's feet crushing him into the ground, that was a wound no healing could erase. I stayed there in the dirt long after the kicks stopped, my body aching, my spirit bleeding. My son walked away as if nothing had happened, leaving me broken on the ground. His wife remained, her eyes full of pity, yet her lips sealed shut. I knew then that something inside me had died, something I could never bring back. Trust had been buried that night, buried deep in the same dirt where I lay. But in its place, something new began to grow. A seed of resolve, a quiet fire, a promise to myself that this moment would not end in silence. I would rise from the dirt. I would carry this pain and turn it into something stronger. And one day, The same house he tried to shame me in would carry the weight of justice he never expected. The days after that night felt heavier than years. My body bore the bruises, purple and black marks that spread across my chest, arms, and legs like shadows that refused to fade. But the real wounds were inside me, silent and unseen, bleeding in a place no medicine could reach. I walked slower, not just because of the pain in my bones, but because my spirit carried the weight of betrayal, the crushing realization that the boy I once called son had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Time has a way of softening most pains, but this one grew sharper with each passing day, echoing in my mind every time I looked at the walls of the house I built with my own 2 hands, the house that now echoed not with laughter, but with cruelty. I would sit in the corner of the courtyard in the mornings, the sun warming my skin, and yet I felt no warmth, only the cold memory of his boots pressing into my ribs. At night, when silence wrapped itself around the house, I lay awake on my thin bed staring at the ceiling, hearing every creak of the wooden beams, every whisper of the wind against the windows. Sleep no longer came to me easily. My body cried out for rest, but my mind replayed the scene again and again, each kick, each strike, each glance from his wife's sorrowful eyes. I wondered what my ancestors would say if they could see me now, lying broken beneath the feet of my own blood. I thought of my father, a stern man who taught me the meaning of dignity and sacrifice. He raised me to believe that respect was the foundation of every home, and I had lived my life by those words. Yet here I was, disrespected, discarded, treated as if my years of toil meant nothing. The silence of the night became my companion, my confessor, and my tormentor. I kept my pain hidden during the day. When neighbors asked how I was, I smiled faintly and said only that age had slowed me down. I would not let them see the shame. I could not let them know that my own son had turned me into dust. Pride still lived within me, though it was battered and scarred. A man may lose his strength, his health, even his place in his own home, but pride is the last flame to die, and I would not let mine be extinguished before its time. So I carried the mask of silence, nodding politely, speaking softly, keeping my grief caged within my chest. But silence is not peace. Silence is a prison, and each day inside that prison felt longer than the last. I began to notice small things I had ignored before. The way his laughter carried a cruelty sharper than a knife. The way he looked at me as if I were a ghost haunting the edges of his life. His wife's silence, too, became louder, a constant reminder that she had seen my humiliation but could not or would not speak. I did not blame her fully. I saw the fear in her eyes, the helplessness of a woman bound by vows to a man whose pride had turned into poison. But knowing she pitied me did not soothe my wounds. It deepened them. For pity is a wound of its own, a reminder that even those who wish to help you cannot, and you are left to rot in your sorrow alone. Each evening I sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, and I thought of the boy he once was. I remembered the small hands that clutched my fingers when he learned to walk, the laughter that once filled these same walls when he chased after me, the pride I felt the day he first stood tall and called me father with a smile that could melt stone. Where had that boy gone? How had he turned into this man of arrogance, this man of cruelty, this man who saw not a father but an obstacle? The questions circled in my mind endlessly, like vultures circling the bones of something long dead. No answer came, only the echo of betrayal. I tried to pray, whispering words into the quiet air, asking the heavens for strength, for wisdom, for even the smallest sign that my suffering had meaning. But even the heavens seemed silent. Perhaps they too wished me to endure, to learn the lesson of betrayal in its harshest form. I had always believed that patience was a virtue, that silence could mend what words could not, but now I began to see the truth. Patience without limits is surrender. Silence without end is slavery. And I was no slave, not to my son, not to my pain, not to the fate that sought to bury me in humiliation. Deep inside me, beneath the sorrow and the scars, something else began to stir. It was not rage, not yet. Rage is loud, reckless, burning too quickly and leaving only ashes. No, What stirred inside me was something quieter, heavier, more enduring. It was resolve. A seed planted in the dirt the night he kicked me down, watered by my tears, fed by my silence, and growing stronger with each insult that followed. Resolve does not shout. Resolve waits. It listens. It sharpens itself in the shadows until the day it is ready to rise. I knew then that my silence would not last forever. One day, when the time was right, when he least expected it, I would rise from the prison of his disrespect and turn the very house he mocked me in into the stage of his downfall. The turning point did not arrive like thunder or fire. It came softly, like a whisper I almost missed. I had grown used to his anger, his coldness, his arrogance pressing down on me like chains. But one evening, as I sat in the corner of the room nursing the ache in my ribs, I saw something that changed everything. His wife stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her eyes fixed on the floor. The light of the lamp fell across her face, and in that light I saw not just silence, but tears. They did not fall loudly. They slid down her cheeks quietly, hidden, as if she feared even her own sobbing might anger him. And in that moment, I understood something I had been blind to for too long. I was not the only prisoner in that house. She was, too. She carried her own bruises, not on the skin where people could see, but in her spirit, in the way her shoulders bent, in the way her voice never rose above a whisper. I watched her carefully over the next days, and the truth revealed itself more clearly with each passing hour. When he barked orders at her, she moved quickly, not out of love, but out of fear. When he laughed, her smile never reached her eyes. When she placed food before him, her hands trembled slightly, as though even the act of serving might be judged. It was then I realized that cruelty had seeped into him like poison, spreading not just toward me, but toward the woman who had promised to stand beside him. And yet, even in her silence, she had not mocked me, had not joined in his laughter, had not turned her back when I lay in the dirt. Her tears on that night were not for herself alone. They were for me, too. For the old man who had been beaten into the soil by the very son he had raised. This realization struck me like a hammer-breaking stone. My son, the child I once carried on my shoulders, was no longer just cruel. He was dangerous. Dangerous to his wife, to his future children, to the very legacy of the family. And in that moment, my heart made a choice my mind had been afraid to make. I would no longer carry him. I would no longer protect him from the consequences of his arrogance. The house I built, the walls that stood because my sweat had soaked into their bricks, would not belong to him. They would belong to someone who understood the meaning of sacrifice, someone who had suffered in silence but had not turned to cruelty. His wife, quiet though she was, had endured with strength I could see shining beneath her sorrow. If anyone deserved the roof over their head, it was her, not the man who wore my blood but carried no trace of my heart. I remember sitting in the garden the next morning, the dew wetting my slippers, the air cool against my skin. Birds sang in the distance, and yet I heard none of it. My mind was filled with the weight of decision. A father is supposed to leave his son an inheritance, a piece of himself that lives on after he is gone. But what happens when that son has burned the bridge between them, when he has trampled the very hands that built his future? Does blood demand loyalty even when it poisons the soul? Or does justice rise above blood, claiming its rightful place in the balance of life? These were the questions I asked myself as I sat in the dawn light, watching the sun rise over a house that would soon no longer belong to him. For many years, I thought the greatest betrayal was his cruelty. But I began to see that the greater betrayal would be my silence, my inaction, my willingness to let him inherit what he had not earned. If I left the house in his hands, I would be giving cruelty a throne and rewarding betrayal with power. I could not do it. My soul would not rest. My ancestors would not forgive me. And so the decision hardened within me, like iron cooling into steel. My son had kicked me into the dirt. He had treated me as less than nothing. But I would not leave this world giving him more than he deserved. Instead, I would give it to the woman whose tears had spoken more loudly than any words. I rose slowly, my bones aching, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt clarity. I was not acting out of revenge alone. I was acting out of justice, out of dignity, out of the desire to see love, not cruelty, protected within these walls. My son had chosen his path, and that path would lead him to the streets. His wife, however, still had a chance to protect herself and her children, to build a life free from the chains of his arrogance. And I would be the one to give her that chance. The same hands that built the house would now decide its fate, and they would write a story different from the one my son expected. That was the turning point. The moment my silence ended, and my resolve took its first breath. I was no longer just an old man waiting for death in the corner of his own home. I was a father, a builder, a man with one last decision to make, and I would make it not with fists or kicks or anger, but with paper, ink, and the weight of law. My son thought his strength came from his youth, from the power of his body over mine. But true strength comes not from muscles or kicks. It comes from wisdom, from patience, from the ability to wait until the right moment to strike. And when I struck, it would not be with violence. It would be with justice. The very next morning, after my decision had settled into my bones, I dressed myself slowly, each button on my shirt feeling heavier than the last. My hands trembled as they often did, not only from age, but from the weight of what I was about to do. This was not an ordinary errand. This was the cutting of a chain, the breaking of a bond that had tied me in silence for too long. I took my walking stick, stepped out into the cool air, and began the slow journey to the lawyer's office. Every step carried memories. The first stone I laid when building that house, the nights I went hungry so my son could eat, the laughter of a child I once carried proudly. Those memories burned as I walked, but they also reminded me why this step was necessary. My son had destroyed the meaning of inheritance with his cruelty. Now it was my turn to rewrite the legacy. The lawyer looked surprised to see me, for I had not visited in many years. Age makes old men invisible, and I could see in his eyes that he thought perhaps I was there to prepare for my funeral, to write the final words of my will. In truth, I was there to write something far heavier than my death. I was there to write justice into paper. I told him plainly, my voice steady, though my heart raced. I wanted the house transferred, not to my son, not to the bloodline that had mocked me and kicked me into the dirt, but to my daughter-in-law. His pen paused mid-air, and he studied me carefully, perhaps thinking he had misheard. But I repeated it. My son's name would vanish from the property. The walls he thought would always belong to him would no longer bear his shadow. The home I built would belong to the woman who had endured his cruelty in silence, but never joined in it. The process began. Papers were drawn, clauses written, seals pressed into the ink. Each page was a nail closing the coffin of his arrogance. I watched with a stillness I had not felt in years. I signed my name slowly, every letter like a strike of a hammer on iron. With every stroke of the pen, I remembered the night he kicked me 9 times into the dirt. With every seal the lawyer stamped, I saw his wife's quiet tears in the glow of the lamp. Justice was no longer a dream. It was being written before my eyes, bound by the law, untouchable by his temper or fists. My son could raise his voice, he could raise his hand, but he could not raise his way out of ink that had already dried. When the papers were complete, the lawyer leaned back, satisfied. He explained the legal power behind them, how no one could challenge the transfer once it was registered. I listened in silence, but inside me, the fire burned hotter than ever. For years, my son thought his strength made him invincible, that he could humiliate me and still claim what was mine after I was gone. But strength fades. Age will catch him too one day. And when that day comes, he will remember this moment. Not because he was there to see the papers signed, but because he will feel the cold sting of betrayal when he realizes the house is no longer his. As I left the office, I held the documents in my hand. They felt light, but they carried the weight of generations. They carried my dignity, my justice, my revenge. I thought of my ancestors, the men and women who came before me, who had built with their hands and prayed with their hearts that the next generation would honor the work they left behind. My son had broken that chain with his cruelty, but with these papers, I had repaired it. The house would not be handed to arrogance. It would not be left to a man who mocked his father. It would pass instead to someone who, despite her own suffering, had shown humility and quiet strength. I walked home slower than before, but lighter. The sun above me seemed brighter, though I knew nothing in the world had changed except for the pages tucked beneath my arm. Yet everything inside me had changed. I was no longer powerless. I was no longer a prisoner in silence. My revenge was not in fists or shouts. It was in the quiet dignity of a choice he would never see coming. My son thought he had won when he kicked me into the dirt. But the real victory was being written in rooms he did not enter, in papers he would not touch until it was far too late. When I entered the house that evening, he looked at me with his usual arrogance, smirking as though my silence meant defeat. He did not know the truth. He did not see the power I now carried. He did not realize that with one decision, one signature, I had erased his claim to everything he thought was his. He mocked me still, but his laughter rolled off me like rain on stone. For the first time in years, I looked at him and felt no fear, no shame, no weakness, only calm, only patience. Because I knew what was coming, and he did not. And that ignorance was its own punishment. The day I chose to speak was not chosen lightly. I waited for the moment when voices would gather, when eyes would watch, when the truth could not be turned away. It came during the annual family gathering, a time when laughter and pride filled the air. The house was alive with chatter, the smell of food, the sound of children running between tables. My son moved through the crowd with that same arrogance, greeting relatives with a smile he thought was charm. His wife lingered at the edge of the crowd, quiet and watchful. I stood to the side, holding in my hands the papers that carried my justice. They were folded neatly, the ink dry, the seals permanent. I waited for the right breath, the right moment to lay them bare. When the gathering reached its warmest hum, I stood slowly. My cane tapped against the floor with quiet authority. The room shifted as heads turned toward me. I could feel the weight of every gaze, the curiosity stirring in the air. My son looked at me with mild surprise, as though I was some old man preparing another tale of the past. But there was no tale tonight, only truth. I held up the papers, letting them catch the light. Murmurs began, low at first, then growing. I began to speak, my voice calm but carrying the weight of years. I told them what had happened, not with anger, not with drama, but with clarity. I spoke of the night he kicked me 9 times into the dirt, the silence of his wife as she watched, and the years of disrespect that had led to that moment. I did not need to raise my voice. The crowd leaned in. Faces turned pale. Children stopped their games. The air thickened with something heavy, something that could not be erased. I spoke of my decision, of why I went to the lawyer, why I changed the papers. I told them plainly that the house, built with sweat and years of labor, would no longer belong to my son. It would belong to his wife, the woman who had lived in that house with dignity despite the cruelty she endured. I explained that my son had removed himself from our family by his actions, and thus the legacy of our home must be given to someone who truly deserved it. As I spoke, silence settled like a curtain. I could hear the hum of disbelief passing through the crowd. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with shock. My son stood frozen, his face pale, his jaw tight. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Around us, whispers began to grow louder, family members exchanging glances, voices trembling with surprise. His wife's eyes were fixed on me, a mixture of relief and gratitude shining in them. I saw in her a quiet strength I had recognized before, a dignity born from years of silent suffering. That dignity now belonged to her, along with the home. I did not shout. I did not demand applause or sympathy. I let my words stand as proof, letting the papers speak louder than my voice. I placed them gently on the table for everyone to see. There they lay, heavy with meaning. The house was no longer his. The arrogance he wore like armor had been stripped away in the most public way possible. My son's laughter, his insults, his kicks, everything had led to this moment. And in that moment, the truth was laid bare for everyone to witness. I watched as my son's shoulders sagged under the weight of silence. His power, his pride, vanished like smoke. Relatives whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others staring in stunned disbelief. I looked around and saw the eyes of my grandchildren, wide and questioning. They did not understand every word, but they felt the weight of what had been said. They saw the pain in my face, the resolve in my stance, and the justice in the papers. I knew they would carry this lesson with them for the rest of their lives. I stepped back then, letting the crowd settle, letting the truth breathe. The air was heavy with unspoken words, but no one spoke. My son stood rooted to the spot, unable to meet my eyes. His wife looked at him once, then turned away quietly. The room felt still, as if time itself had stopped, and in that stillness, I felt the victory of years of silence turning into a moment of truth. I had spoken. I had acted. I had shown them all who deserved respect and who deserved nothing at all. The house was hers now. His laughter had been replaced by the sound of a legacy reclaimed. The moment my words settled into silence, the air around us shifted. The gathering no longer carried the warmth it once had. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of disbelief, sympathy, and the slow awakening of understanding. My son stood still, his face pale, lips pressed tightly together as though trying to swallow the shame rising inside him. His eyes darted to his wife, then to the floor, unable to meet mine. The crowd felt the weight of the revelation, and the silence became heavier with every breath. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed the truth I had spoken. Whispers passed through the circle of relatives, some shaking their heads, others nodding quietly in agreement. My grandchildren, who had been playing earlier, stopped their games and stood still, looking at their father and then at me. I could see confusion in their eyes, the unspoken question of what had just happened. They had never seen such a moment in their lives. For them, this was not only a lesson about justice, it was a lesson about who stands for what in a family. I saw the change in their faces, a mixture of respect for me and disappointment toward their father. His wife remained quiet, but her eyes told the story. They were filled with relief, gratitude, and something else I recognized: long suppressed courage. She had endured years of silence and suffering, watching him treat me with contempt. Now she stood as proof that truth could break the chains of cruelty. Others looked at her differently, some offering nods, others whispering softly about the decision I had made. In that moment, I understood something deeply. My choice was not just about me, but about showing her and the children that dignity is worth protecting, even when betrayal runs deep. My son's shoulders slumped as though the air had been pulled from him. He stepped back, his mouth opening once as if to speak, then closing again. No words came. He turned slightly, his eyes avoiding everyone in the room. I could feel the shift in power. The arrogance he once held was gone. In its place was silence, heavy and loud, speaking louder than any argument. Relatives exchanged glances, some surprised by my action, others quietly relieved. The respect in the room had shifted, and it was now mine again, not by force, but by truth. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. No one moved to break the silence for a long time. I could see people thinking, judging, understanding. My son's face told me what his voice could not: anger, shame, and disbelief all tangled together. His pride had been stripped away in the most public way possible. The house I had built, the years of labor and care, had been given to the woman who respected it, who respected me. That was the justice I sought. That was the lesson I wanted to pass on. Some relatives came closer to me quietly after the announcement, offering words of support. Others stayed back, unsure how to act. I did not speak much to them. I let the moment stand on its own. This was not a time for argument or explanation. This was a time for truth to sink in. I looked around at the faces, young and old, relatives and friends, and I saw that the story was already rewriting itself in their minds. Respect had returned, not through force, but through action. And in that moment, I felt peace. My son stepped away from the crowd, his movements stiff, his head lowered. His wife stayed by the house's entrance, her hands folded quietly. The children gathered near her, looking toward me with questions that did not need answers right then. I knew they would remember this moment, not as a day of conflict, but as the day when respect and dignity stood taller than cruelty. The room still hummed softly with conversation, but the tone had changed. It was no longer about laughter or pride. It was about truth, and truth had been spoken. The fallout did not end that day. It followed my son wherever he went, in whispers behind closed doors, in the way relatives treated him afterward. His reputation, once built on arrogance and disregard, was quietly dismantled. The house stood as a symbol of the choice I made, not to punish and rage, but to protect what was right. I saw it in the way his wife looked at me, in the quiet nods of those who once doubted me, in the way my grandchildren began to look at me with admiration. That silence after the revelation was no longer empty. It was full of meaning. The days after that gathering were quiet, but the change was loud. The air in the house felt different, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened. My son no longer spoke to me the way he once had. He avoided my gaze, his pride replaced by a deep and lasting shame. The arrogance that once filled his voice was gone. In its place was silence, heavy, cold, and telling. I understood then that the truth I had spoken had pierced deeper than any argument could. It had changed him in ways no words could undo. My son was left with nothing but his bitterness. The house, the life I had built for generations, belonged now to his wife and children. That decision was deliberate. I wanted her to have a home free from cruelty, a place where the children could grow without fear. I knew she would honor it because she had shown respect where he had given none. She had stood quietly, bearing witness to what I endured, and that courage deserved reward. That house was not only her shelter, but also my answer to years of humiliation. In the days that followed, relatives came quietly to visit. Some brought food, others simply came to nod in solidarity. The whispers grew into conversations about dignity, respect, and the price of silence. I did not seek praise, I only sought peace for the rest of my life. The streets, once filled with the noise of gossip, began to quiet. People began to understand the choice I had made and the lesson it carried. Justice had been done, not with anger, but with resolve. And that justice was my final gift. My grandchildren began to visit more often. They wanted to hear the stories of their grandfather, who stood for truth. They came with questions I was ready to answer. I told them of hard work, of sacrifice, and of the weight of love that comes without condition. I told them of respect and the courage it takes to defend it. They listened quietly, absorbing more than words, learning a lesson they would carry forever. I knew that this was part of my revenge, not a vengeance of anger, but a lesson that would shape them for life. His wife grew steadier, stronger in the days that followed. I saw her move with a sense of ownership that came from respect, not entitlement. The children laughed more freely, no longer under the shadow of their father's anger. The home became a place of safety, a place where love could grow without fear. That was the victory I had wanted, not for myself, but for them. My act of giving the house to her was more than a legal decision. It was a promise kept to those who could not protect themselves. I walked away from him without bitterness. I walked away knowing that the streets he now called home were a reflection of his choices. He had chosen cruelty over care, disrespect over love, silence over understanding. And so, the life he built for himself crumbled quietly. I did not wish for his downfall. I only wished to protect what remained sacred, the dignity of my heart, the safety of those I loved, and the lesson that respect cannot be stolen, only earned. The aftermath was not measured in days, but in moments. A smile from my grandchildren, a nod of gratitude from my daughter-in-law, the quiet respect of my neighbors. These became the quiet rewards that filled my old heart. I knew that the path I chose would echo in my family for years to come. It was not vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was a shaping of truth. And truth, once spoken, changes lives forever. I carried no anger in the days that followed, only a deep and lasting peace. My body still felt the memory of those 9 kicks, but my spirit was lighter than it had been in years. I had traded the pain of humiliation for the satisfaction of justice. I had traded silence for action. My son had lost a house, but I had gained my dignity back. That was my victory. That was my revenge. The house stood there, not just as a home, but as a symbol that love without respect becomes cruelty, a symbol that silence in the face of betrayal is a wound that grows, a symbol that when one stands for truth, they leave behind more than bricks and wood. They leave a lesson for generations, and that was the legacy I wanted. That was my choice. That was my peace. Now, as an old man, I tell this story without bitterness, without hatred, without regret. I tell it with the calm that comes from knowing I did what was right. My son's cruelty did not destroy me. It shaped me. It taught me that respect is not given, it is earned. It taught me that love without boundaries becomes a wound. It taught me that dignity must be defended even when the cost is high. And I paid that cost without hesitation, because some things are worth more than comfort. They are worth truth. I have learned that life gives us moments to choose who we are. That moment for me came the night he kicked me 9 times. It was not just a night of pain. It was a night of awakening. I understood that silence would only make him stronger. I understood that to protect those I loved, I had to act. I understood that my life's work, the years of sacrifice, needed a voice. That voice became action, quiet but unshakable. That action became my message to him, to my family, and to the world. Looking back, I see clearly the path I chose. I see the nights I stayed silent, hoping for change. I see the day I made my decision. I see the look on my daughter-in-law's face when she learned the house was hers. I see my grandchildren's faces, bright and innocent, filled with questions. I see the look in my son's eyes when he realized the truth had been spoken in the only way I could speak it, through justice, not vengeance. That look is etched in my memory forever. I tell this story now not to boast, but to teach. I want my grandchildren to understand what it means to stand for what is right. I want them to know that strength is not in the ability to harm, but in the courage to protect. I want them to learn that dignity is not given, it is defended. I want them to understand that the love of a father is a gift, but that gift must be met with respect. That is my lesson to them. That is my gift to them. As I sit in my chair now, years later, I still feel the weight of that night. Not the weight of pain, but the weight of decision. I feel the quiet peace that comes when you know you have acted with truth and courage. I feel the satisfaction that comes when injustice is answered. I feel the warmth of knowing I have left a legacy worth remembering. I feel certain that my choice has shaped more than a house. It has shaped hearts and minds for generations. My son's life went on without me. He faced his own path, his own consequences. I do not wish him harm, but I do wish he had learned what I learned, that cruelty eats away at the soul, and silence can be as deep a wound as any strike. I wish he had seen that respect builds bonds, and without it, even the strongest walls fall. I wish he had understood that family is not only blood, but trust, honor, and care. These lessons he missed, but I hope his children learn them instead. I have no bitterness in my heart now, only clarity. I have no desire to return to the pain of that night, because pain taught me what silence could not. I have no need for revenge, because justice became my peace. I have no regret for the choice I made, because it was born of love for those who mattered most, my grandchildren, my daughter-in-law, and the truth of my own dignity. That choice stands as my legacy. He left me in the dirt. I left him in the streets. That is my story. That is my truth. That is my life. And now, as I look toward the years I have left, I know that the lesson I gave them will remain far longer than the pain I endured. I know that respect, once restored, is stronger than any grievance. I know that dignity, once defended, is eternal. I know that love without respect is nothing, and respect without love is empty. So I tell this story to you now, not for pity, not for applause, but so you remember. Remember that no act of cruelty should go unanswered. Remember that silence is not always peace. Remember that your dignity is yours to protect. Remember that in the end, we all leave behind more than our lives. We leave behind the lessons we taught. And I chose to leave behind a lesson in courage, truth, and justice. That is my reflection. That is my peace. That is my revenge.